perfect. Then let's wait a minute or two for people to join. I see people are already coming, and then we start. Yeah.
I did want to mention quickly that I think regarding the moderator, I think Abby from Open City Lab might join, but I'll ask her to add a comment at the end. So I wouldn't ask her, I wasn't going to ask her to moderate.
We can easily make her a panelist if you would like, Paul.
Yeah, let's just see if she joins. I think it just depends if she was able to make it. So if you see if she is there.
Can you please share her name again? I didn't pick it up.
It should be Abby from...
Abby. I don't see an Abby at the moment.
So Abigail Kemper. So she might join, but I thought part of what I was going to touch on was some of the work that OCL was involved in indirectly. So I thought at the end of the presentation, I might ask her if she is online. I may ask her to just comment on that.
Okay, perfect. We can make her a panelist very quickly. Okay, but I think now it's time to start. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the. Sorry, why does this? I was complaining earlier that what happens here? Stop share. Yeah. Okay, sorry. I was complaining earlier that 1 year in the pandemic, we don't know how Zoom works, and now I'm struggling. Yeah. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Data at Breakfast. My name is Francesco Petruccione, and this morning I'm very happy to introduce to you today's speaker, which is Dr. Paul Plantinga. Paul is based at the HSRC, the Human Sciences Research Council, where he's working specifically in the impact center of the HSRC. And he's managing the Policy Action Network project and exploring various uses of digital technology to support evidence-based decision making. So we are very happy to have him with us today. And he will speak, as you know, about getting more from government metadata. Yeah? And that is really, in particular, in times of COVID, a very, very topical subject. Also because, you know, I think government is also promoting heavily open science and open data. You know, it's always a fine balance between as open as possible and as closed as necessary. Yeah. So I'm sure that Paul will put us now very nicely in the picture of this subject. So Paul, people are here to listen to you, not to me. So if you would like to start sharing your screen, you're welcome to begin your presentation. And while you set up, a quick reminder to the participants to please use the Q&A facility to ask questions, or since we are not so many, you're most welcome to raise your hand, and we will make a plan to give you the rights to speak. Yeah. So Paul, I see your screen, your first slide clearly. You're welcome to start the presentation. Thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Prof. Good morning to everyone. Good, very early morning. This is probably the first time I've done a 7:30 presentation, other than for other countries. Just apologies from my side if it's a bit dark. I don't have power for part of my house, so luckily I do have internet connection. So I hope you can see me, but at least you have the slides, so you don't need to look at me. So Prof. Petruccione and myself have a bit of an eclectic background. I was involved in UKZN for about a year, working with the tech transfer office at Incubate. And looking at commercialization work. So I now have moved into more of I suppose, information brokering role instead of a commercialization brokering role at the Human Sciences Research Council. So the Impact Center is really a program that's meant to support the uptake of research within public interest decision making generally. So we are actually a relatively newly re-established program. Previously, we were called the Research Use and Impact Assessment Unit. So we have a similar role in brokering the use of research within various policy making arenas. And I don't think, to be honest, I don't think many of us have done this very well, whether we're more in the industrial, I suppose, harder sciences, where we struggle with things like technology uptake in government, but also the private sector, as well as commercialization. But the same applies to the social sciences, where economists and social scientists are developing or conducting quite interesting research, but it's not necessarily being used in public sector decision making. It's not being used by civil society necessarily as much as most people would like. And the research councils, I suppose, having a more applied mandate, are in a similar position. So that's anyway a space that we're looking to work in. We're doing some, because it's relatively new, we're doing some quite exploratory work, and I'll touch on some of that today. So it is quite early stages in some of the projects we've been engaging on, but I hope some of this is of interest. It's certainly going to be softer than a lot of the topics that you're working with. I've moved from engineering positions into much more of a policy kind of project management space, so it's not going to be very technical, but hopefully there's something of interest in what I'm talking about. I'm sure I didn't actually ask Prof if you've had talks by some of the people I've worked with over the years, but I'm sure most of you know about Open Cities Lab and some of the other civic tech organizations around the country who have been working, especially in the open data movement. So over the years, I've interacted with a lot of them, and they obviously do quite exciting work with open data and open government data, especially. So as I was saying earlier, if Abigail's on the call, I'll ask her to comment briefly on some of the work they've been doing around open contracting. But certainly that's an area that I'm going to touch on indirectly today, but also a little bit more broadly. So just to go into some of the slides, so the program that I manage specifically that's within the Impact Center is called Policy Action Network. It's actually a fairly old program, but we've also been re-establishing that recently. And it was originally conceived as a kind of traditional brokering platform, so and largely online. So the HSRC would produce research on various topics. We just, for example, released the findings from the TIMS science and maths surveys for science and maths, science and maths education at schools. And that was, I think it was released in December. So we participated in those large-scale surveys to assess, for example, performance in maths and science by students and schools. So the results are released, and then programs like the Policy Action Network and the Impact Center attempt to package that, or work with our colleagues in the divisions to package that data, to package the research in more digestible forms for policy decision making, for informing the public about what the findings of the research are, to stimulate dialogue, discussion about the findings from that research. So that's effectively where the Policy Action Network was working, and was in this, when it was originally conceived, it was really about transferring research to policy makers in a fairly linear form. So in the past couple of years, we've been thinking through how the decision-making process and how policy influence actually works. And for us, it becomes much more about exploring the pathways to policy impact and to social impact more broadly. So we, as I mentioned before, we have an interest in supporting public interest decision-making, and the public sector is clearly an extremely large part of it, but but there are many other stakeholders in this space. So civil society organizations, the private sector, quasi-governmental organizations, etc., are all involved. And the pathways to influencing decisions are usually extremely dispersed, and there are many branches and many iterations that take place in that process. So for us, we've been trying to move to supporting the flow of research, whether it's from the HSRC as well as other kind of more traditional knowledge producers, to support kind of connections between those different knowledge producers, and to explore the more diverse pathways that we could potentially influence public interest policy making. So, for example, instead of having a direct flow to a policymaker, we might go via one or two government entities, maybe civil society organizations, all the way through to eventually a parliamentary committee working on for example, education curriculum policy, for example. So there are, for us, it's about understanding how that policy pathway might work, and what is the most effective way of translating research into policy action. Part of it is especially for PAN, and it's the direction we're starting to go with Policy Action Network specifically, is to see how we can start working with digital tools more specifically, and how those can complement what are maybe more relational processes. I think that's the experience that I've had with commercialization and commercialization of technology generally, is that unfortunately it's just the reality of things, is that it's about the relationships and developing relationships over several years. We try not to say many, because I think you get a bit of fatigue, but the commercialization process, when we're working with startups and university entrepreneurs, it really is taking kind of 4 to 5 to 10 years before we see any commercial success. So it's similar with this space. It's about developing relationships over many years, but now also then looking at the role of technology as a complementary enabler. So the PAN program, we work with essentially 4 areas. The one is around supporting the use of data, whether that's research data, government administrative data, official statistical data. So supporting the use of data and awareness, data literacy, awareness of data within the public sector, but also amongst journalists, civil society, etc. So that's where we connect with programs such as the open data community around supporting data use. The second one is really around networks of knowledge exchange. So where there are networks such as local government networks or civil society networks, to support those networks so that they can grow as enablers of knowledge transfer. So networks for us are quite important. So it's exploring how those can be supported. I'm just going to touch on the 4th one, because the 3rd is where I'm going to go to next. So the 4th is really around digital media, language, and the arts. So again, this is really around the communication of research and how we can make it more engaging and more relevant to people's kind of daily lives in a way that they can understand and find relevant. And then the 3rd is around evidence synthesis, and that's really about how do we source and synthesize large bodies of research evidence, and then package it in ways that is more accessible to various policy actors in the public and civil society sectors. So that's, for me, is quite a new area, but there has been quite substantial work done around evidence synthesis in the country, and I think it's a growing space. So that's, I'm going to focus, I suppose that the focus of my original thinking of the presentation has shifted slightly more towards introducing a project that we've been involved in around the evidence synthesis space and the metadata that we're working with there to support the decision-making process. And then I'll also touch briefly on the contracting one, but I'll spend less time there. So I'm going to focus on an example around the evidence interspace and working with metadata around research there. So I'm just going to minimize that quickly. So for us, there's three questions really around public interest decision support. So, and for this presentation really, just for the focus here. So the one is around what information and pathways can we use to influence decision-making using research evidence as kind of formal research evidence, but then also stakeholder knowledge is an important part of policy processes. So that's often kind of falls under what people call the politics of decision-making, but I think we like to call it stakeholder knowledge as a more to reflect the knowledge that people have on the ground of issues that they're dealing with. Then the second point I'm going to address is around how metadata can potentially help. Well, data and metadata, I think the line between the two becomes blurred, but anyway, broadly looking at metadata and the two examples that I'm touching on. And then what kind of government practices and standards and actually business models can support work with metadata. That's actually a much broader topic, and I'll see if I can get into that, but that's something perhaps for another day, is around the different kind of public sector business models that are in play, especially with state-owned enterprises and how they operate and the extent to which that enables or inhibits the use of data. And entities like Open City Labs and others are working in that space more actively around instruments like data trusts and others, which I'm sure they would be able to speak on too. So, sorry. Okay, so this is just, this is just an area of research that South Africans and Africans are working in around evidence, and the intention is not to go through these. It's just two examples that you're welcome to have a look at another time. But this is closely associated with the University of Johannesburg's Africa Center for Evidence and the Africa Evidence Network, where there's a lot of attention being placed on evidence use. So, certainly the supply of evidence and conducting rigorous research is is incredibly important. But there has been quite a strong shift to looking at how evidence use can be enabled. And obviously the public sector and government is a big priority. So how can government decision makers be supported with using evidence, and especially formal research evidence? So on the left is an example of a 6-stage approach that is being used around supporting building capabilities and institutionalizing evidence use. And on the right is a more iterative example where working through different stages of raising awareness, building capacity, and facilitating the use of evidence from an individual to an institutional level. So again, it's speaking to similar concerns about how we, for us, about how we engage with policymakers, as they're often called, to raise awareness around data and evidence and research, and essentially secure their buy-in to working with the evidence that's being produced by researchers across the country and globally, and what strategies we can use to do that, whether it's starting whether that's through a more of a top-down process or working, as the right-hand example suggests, working with individuals and then scaling up to the team and the organization and institutional level through that kind of those iterations of influence. So one example of a tool or an instrument that's started to gain quite a lot of traction, and that's being pushed quite heavily by the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, as well as ACE at UJ has been around evidence maps. And if this is an area of interest, I realize it may not be for some in the audience, but it's really around the management of evidence and use. There is a new draft I think it's a draft, but there's a new framework around evidence use that was released in December by DPME. And instruments such as evidence mapping are forming a more significant part of the new frameworks that are coming out within government around using evidence, and the socio-economic impact assessments are becoming mandatory before policies are implemented within government entities. So government entities are increasingly obliged to now conduct these socio-economic impact assessments, and to use tools such as evidence maps and evidence synthesis, etc., as part of those evaluations, and then ultimately the decision-making process. So evidence map is really a tool that it just creates a picture of the landscape of research in a specific policy area. So in this case, the one you can see on the screen, I see the link is not showing, but I can provide the links later. The one you can see on the screen is related to the land reform process in South Africa, which you will remember was happening last year. So as part of that, the team at DPME worked with ACE to produce an evidence map around the various policy elements of land reform. So I'm afraid you might struggle to read some of the column and row headers here. But on the left-hand side, and this is how most evidence maps are structured, on the left-hand side are policy interventions. So for example, in land reform, you might have instruments such as redistribution, land tenure, land use management, land administration. So those are all instruments that are potentially can be used in the land reform space. And then on the column headers, there are the policy outcomes, or typically the policy outcomes or the policy needs that the policy actors are looking to achieve. So in this case, it's a bit hard to read again, but and this one is slightly different, but you might have outcomes such as economic, improvement in income of individuals living in certain areas of the country. So income might be one, security of land tenure, various other outcomes that policy actors are looking to achieve. And then this framework so the policy environment is used to create essentially the column rows and the column headings and the row headings. And then a systematic collection of research is then done to collect research that speaks to those different policy interventions and outcomes. So in the case of, for example, the very fuzzy redistribution example, where redistribution is then associated with spatial justice, the team that's developing this evidence map will source evidence, so formal research articles. They, for example, might find 50 research articles that speak to the relationship between redistribution and spatial justice as an outcome. They will then collect the metadata related to those articles, such as obviously things like the article title and the authors and institutions, but then also the different policy interventions and outcomes it speaks to, as well as doing a critical appraisal of those research articles. So whether the research process that was followed was kind of high, medium, or low quality, what is the bias in the research process, that kind of thing. And then they can classify the quality, effectively classifying the quality of the research in each of those cells. And you can see in that example, they use a green. A green indicates that the research is high quality. The black essentially indicating that it's kind of medium quality. And then the red and yellow tend to be lower quality. So for each policy area, you can get a sense of the amount of research, which is indicated by the size of the circle, and then the quality of the research is indicated by the coloring on the circle. So I hope that's reasonably clear, but you can read more into that space at a later stage. I'm just conscious of time, so I don't want to run over too much. So importantly for policy actors, this is giving them an overview of the policy space, an easy and a potentially easy entry point to finding research related to specific policy areas. Importantly for us, and from a PAN perspective, we're interested in how these processes are potentially can be more open going forward. So I think there is more, and I think COVID has been an example, there's more interest in how decisions related to specific policy issues have come about from public policy actors. So we potentially can start making, we can make the evidence that's being used for decisions more public. The DPME actually has a website where you can see their socioeconomic impact assessments and that are published related to specific policy issues. So there is much more transparency around what evidence is being used to inform decisions. And then also there's the interconnected nature of decision making. So often policy issues are connected and interventions are connected to each other. So you can now start seeing clusters of research related to different policy interventions and outcomes and look at the evidence in a cluster or a row or a column if you wanted to focus on a specific intervention or outcome. Anyway, so that's a policy, that's an evidence map, and that's a space that we've been working on in the last year. Importantly, again, I'm not going to go through it's an example from a DPME guide in the space, but importantly, the first step in these engagement processes is to co-create a policy narrative with essentially the evidence users. And also to agree on what constitutes policy evidence. So often we would assume that the research that we produce is completely infallible and independent, but there's important discussions that need to happen around what your inclusion and exclusion criteria are for evidence-informed decision making. So there's always that balance between the independence of researchers and then finding a pragmatic way to influence policy decision making, to support policy decision making. So importantly, co-creating the policy narrative is part of that, so that the users of the evidence are involved in defining those column headings and row headings, so that they create, essentially they are part of creating that framework for what evidence is sourced. Which of course is an interesting discussion on its own. So just jumping to what we've been involved with recently, and I'll start getting into that more now, but this is some of what we've done over the past year is specifically around the health system space. And if you've been involved in that area, you would, the pink diagram in the bottom left would be somewhat familiar to you, as it speaks to what the WHO uses as their kind of core components of the public health system. We use that along with consultation and local policy material to develop a framework for public health systems in South Africa. So we created a similar framework to what I showed you previously in the land reform example, but focusing in this case on health systems. So I think I have another slide later where it speaks to the actual interventions and outcomes, which will become a bit clearer. As part of that process, so we created a framework similar to the land reform one, but to support the actual process of metadata collection, we then worked with DPME, who had previously developed metadata collection tools. We essentially developed one that was adapted for the public health system space and made it a little bit more usable for the scale of work that we were involved in. So this is an example of a metadata collection tool that's used by the team that's involved in developing the evidence map. And they use this to essentially evaluate every single article. And there might be, in the health system example, we started off with about probably about 30,000 research articles from the search process. and then essentially filtered it down to an evaluation and metadata capturing for about 2,000 odd articles. So an extraction was done by a team of researchers to collect metadata on those 1,500 to 2,000 plus research articles, and essentially classifying each of those research articles based on what outcomes that research article speaks to. So in the health system space, that often involves things like your health outcomes, but also the quality of for example, a hospital service delivery, whether issues around efficiency, the equity of interventions, so whether a policy, for some certain policy intervention increases access to healthcare services. And then on the right-hand side of the interventions, things like training. Sorry, I should pay attention to the chat in case there's anything there. So specific interventions in the health system space, and that typically spans things like service delivery. So how is actual healthcare and health service delivery structured? So is it more decentralized or centralized? The workforce, so are there, what kind of training is provided to healthcare workers? How is their performance managed? And then things around information and information systems, so health information systems, and then the management of medical products, vaccines and technology. So those are interventions related to things such as the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, that kind of thing. So I'm not sure if this is becoming clearer, and hopefully it can become clearer, and I'm happy to answer questions, but we were looking at the relationship between interventions on the right-hand side and certain outcomes on the left-hand side. All right, so we collected metadata for roughly actually in the end, around 2,200 articles. And then we did an analysis actually, and it's meant to go into a map similar to the land reform one that I showed you earlier, but we haven't got to that stage yet. So this is literally 2 days of completion. So this is very much working metadata analysis. So we automated the import of all the extracted data and have pulled it essentially into a Google Sheet, and then done some initial analysis and looking at, and here you can see an extract of a evidence map with the outcomes, the health outcomes on the top and the interventions on the left-hand side. So I think there's a more intuitive example. Sorry, let me just minimize this. So for example, if you look at the relationship and between training as a horizontal, as a policy intervention, and sorry, I've cut off, so that's actually a bad example now. But the effectiveness of health interventions. So the effectiveness is essentially, do people have a positive health outcome from an intervention? That's obviously a very important area. So much of the research evidence that we collected speaks to the relationship to the effectiveness of healthcare interventions. So as you can see, for example, one of the most the busiest area, probably the busiest area in the entire evidence map was related to the relationship between the delivery models, so how healthcare service delivery was structured, whether it involved, whether it was more centralized or decentralized, whether communities were involved in the healthcare delivery processes, community health workers, those kind of things. So those all speak to the delivery model. And then, so there is a huge amount of research relative to other areas in the relationship between the delivery models and the effectiveness of the delivery of healthcare. So in terms of an outcome. But there are obviously other areas. Let me see if there's one I can highlight. One of the good examples is being cut off, but training is a typical one. So the better trained your health workforce is, the more likely it is to have a positive impact on health outcomes. So there is a large amount of research relating on the relationship between training of the health workforce and health outcomes. All right, so that's currently where we are. I'm just going to jump forward because I see I'm using up all the time. This is just a quick analysis, and this is very much working data, so it's not, I wouldn't say it should be used for anything at this stage, but I thought it's still interesting to show. So importantly, what we did was a review of, we only worked at a review level. So this is not primary research data that we were collecting, just because of the size of the field. So in this case, we can see the different types of research that were being conducted, and much of it was around systematic reviews with meta-analysis, which is typically involves narrative synthesis of primary research. So there is a large amount of research articles that are of that kind. There are also systematic reviews with meta-analysis, which are typically considered the gold standard of research evidence for decision-making. So that is the next highest level of evidence that we have in the evidence map. I'm just going to skip on partly because I just want to highlight the other area that I suppose is an emerging area of interest. So that just concludes the work we've been doing around the evidence mapping in the health system space, working with essentially research article metadata. Then one of the areas that we're looking to speak to more directly is around strategic purchasing and procurement in health systems. So this is where we are starting to touch on potential use of data itself around the purchasing and procurement. So moving away from the kind of research evidence to actual data that government is producing. I'm going to skip that slide quickly just to save time. But in the procurement space, and here we're talking more around government administrative data and government and metadata related to government procurement. Government, as you may know, government procurement typically involves, well, 4 or 5 stages, but I've reduced it to roughly 3 for this slide. So most government departments do some kind of procurement planning, where they outline their plans and their budgets for the year for specific items that they're planning to procure. Then during the year, they advertise on portals like e-tenders and they publish their tenders to procure certain services and products. And then they award the tenders to suppliers, and then the projects are implemented by the suppliers. So there are additional stages, of course. But there's obviously certain metadata that's produced across that procurement process that is potentially very valuable to decision making. There's obviously a big transparency angle that's important for the integrity of procurement in the country, but for us, there's also potentially opportunities for business intelligence around procurement processes and how they can become more efficient, competitive, etc. So working with that metadata, there's been some initial work done within the field and by organizations like Transparency International to explore the use of open contracting data and the role of the open contracting data standard as a tool. And they've done some initial, I suppose, pilot analysis working with that metadata from the procurement perspective. So they can start looking at things like cost effectiveness. So what is the difference between the price that tenders have been awarded at versus the price that was budgeted in the procurement plans? So what is the average difference between planned amount and award amount? So that is potentially quite interesting to see if planning corresponds with outcomes. You can then also look at things like, is the procurement process efficient? So the difference in time between when a tender was issued to when it's awarded. In South Africa, often tenders have to be reissued multiple times. And for those of us involved in procurement processes in the public sector, it can be very painful because we're reissuing tenders, or tenders drag on for huge amounts of time, which affects service delivery. So a topic of interest is whether the whether procurement processes are efficient and as a, I suppose, proxy for service delivery outcomes to some extent. And then the last one, which is very topical, is whether tenders are competitive. So is there, for example, in a tender, is there only one bidder for a tender, or are there more than one bidder? So it's really just looking at the number of bidders for tenders. As a quick example, in Chile, there's an article online you can have a look at, but they've been tracking the type of tender awards that have been happening. And in this example, they found that the number of direct awards, which is essentially a sole source or single source procurement awarded to a specific organization, the number of direct awards has been increasing compared to the number of public tenders, which was a bad sign at that time in 2018. So for them, they were then able to pick up that there were shifts in how procurement was happening in this case, I think it was around pharmaceutical procurement. So they were then able to pick up that there were shifts in how procurement was happening, and then they could look at interventions to improve how the procurement processes were being done to address that. And then lastly, just to mention a key enabler for that from a data and a metadata perspective is around using tools such as the Open Contracting Data Standard as just one example. In this space, the OCDS is important because it gives you the consistency to be able to compare procurement data across provinces, across countries, because otherwise, as you can imagine, if every province and every municipality is capturing their procurement data in a different way, it becomes very difficult for data analysts, etc., to be able to conduct analysis to assess the efficiency, etc., of procurement processes. So just to conclude, so from our perspective, as I highlighted before, is in addressing the first question around influencing decision-making, an important area is around supporting the use of evidence and looking at multiple pathways to evidence adoption. Our view is that metadata can support a more process-based view of data use and evidence use, which includes, as I mentioned earlier, co-creation of policy narratives, setting up those frameworks with the end users in mind so that there is more buy-in to the use of research and evidence. And then ultimately things like data standards are important for enabling the analysis that can support decision-making going forward. So that's it from my side. I realize I've run over a bit. Prof, if there is time for questions, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, for a very insightful talk about the workings of evidence-based decision-making. You know, it's always easy to complain that decisions are taken without evidence, but to actually do it is sometimes not so straightforward. So no, thank you very much for sharing that with us. I see we don't have questions in the Q&A as far as I can see, but I see that one attendee is raising her hand, and we will allow her to talk now. So Delia, please, you're welcome to ask your question. You just need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Good morning.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much, Francesco, for organizing the talk today. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you very much, Paul. Lovely to meet you. I am Delia North. I'm the Dean and the head of the School of Mathematics, Statistics and Computer Science, but I've been a head of statistics since about 2004. So I'm a statistician, and evidence-based decision-making, of course, is our game. It's been so for all my life. I thoroughly enjoyed it, your talk, as I said. And just to tell you that we have, for more than 20 years, as a group of about 17 statisticians at UKZN, been working very closely with government. I personally have been the master trainer for Statistics South Africa and for their capacity building basic program, which was actually aimed at upskilling teachers. And we've worked with the Office of the Premier, with municipality, of course, with Umalusi, very aware of the TIM study. So really, this is not to tell you that this is our thing and we've been doing it forever. The more and more people that are getting involved to promote evidence-based decision-making, the better. And, you know, this is such an exciting area. And I just want to offer maybe some, not support, maybe just make you aware of what we can do, maybe to enhance in the area of evidence-based decision-making. We started recently, we've always obviously been doing lots of training at university, but we're looking to enhance government as well and industry through the offering of capacity building programs, which go right from the very basic through to PhD. We've got SACWA accredited courses, which are a suite of data science courses, which are really extremely helpful. And you can go right from knowing absolutely nothing and building up, as I say. We offer short courses, we offer degrees, we offer specialized training depending on the needs. So we've got a formally recognized data science unit at UKZN, and we would very much want to work with you. We work closely with the International Statistics Institute. I'm on various level committees internationally in the data science field. So we work with University of Cincinnati, Miami, et cetera, et cetera. So our programs are really, you know, aligned to internationally what is being done in the area of data science training. So really, just to make you aware that we would very much want to be of assistance should you be aware of anybody in government that wants some training in basic data science or decision making. So good work, keep up the good work.
Thank you, Delia.
I'll be very happy.
I don't know if Paul would like to.
Yeah, thanks, Delia. I really appreciate that. Yeah, from my side, I think for us, it's for me personally, it's quite a new area. But I think in general, I think the more support and partnerships we have, the more valuable the work that we can do. We're very limited in what we can do. Certainly, there's the HSRC, which has substantial capacity to do things, but they're also involved in very specific work, whereas areas around capacity building are not necessarily work that colleagues are involved in, and it's something that we're only relatively recently exploring. So being embedded with supporting, especially as I said, the evidence use side of things is an area where we certainly have quite big gaps, and that's where we definitely do need to work through partnerships. I can't see us developing that capacity in the short or even the medium term. So we have to absolutely work with partnerships. Most of our work, honestly, in the data related space around data use has been in the more civic tech arena, just because it's some of the work that I brought with me previously. And a lot of that involved is working with the journalism community and community journalists. So the more embedded work that you've been involved in for many years, and many other people have been as well, is where we really would like to connect. So for us, as you can tell, most of what we've been doing is, I suppose, that very much in the meta level space with a specific part of the government system, but there are many others. There's obviously units working in the presidency, NSG, all of the departmental specific work. I mean, even in health, I'm sure you're much more familiar with it than me. There's multiple spaces of policy and evidence-informed decision making. So yeah, for us, we're working on quite a small slice of it. And exploring some of the tools that are there, and I suppose fitting with our current capabilities. And then, yeah, for sure, I'd love to continue the conversation and just to get to, I suppose, better understand how your work happens and the experiences that you have And I think the more connected the community is, I'm not sure if, for example, you're connected with the UJ team and some of the University of Pretoria people, but it would be great to just connect some of those conversations as part of that wider community. So yeah, I really appreciate that and appreciate the offer. So I'll probably be in touch.
Thank you, Paul, for that. Yeah, and Paul, can I also ask a question? You know, you mentioned a few times the relationship to open data and open science, and I know that the Department of Science and Innovation has been promoting it for a couple of years now, and I think there is already a formal roadmap, and I think they're in the progress of establishing an open science policy of sorts for South Africa. Yeah, but from your experience, how big is the willingness of government departments, to really embrace this open approach? Yeah? Because you know, one thing that I found a little bit strange is that, for instance, I know at the CSIR they're collecting all the data related to COVID, and they have a dashboard and blah blah blah, but it's not available to the public. Yeah, in order to access this, you need to have a CSIR login. Yeah. So how do you gauge this willingness to really to open up the evidence and not to hide it behind maybe not a paywall but a kind of a login wall? Yeah.
Yeah, it is somewhat complex. I suppose there's the broader kind of politics of open government and processes like OGP, which has its own challenges, and I think it's been quite evident over the years. But then there's also I suppose the lower level policy actions and practice where I suppose it comes down to a number of different issues, and part of it is, I think, for me, and I'm not sure if this is accurate, but a lot of it comes down to people's confidence with the data that they work with, and especially with government administrative data. I'm not sure colleagues are confident in the data space generally and with the processes they're following. And I suppose a lot of that is also just traditions of how especially research data is managed. And the same applies to the HSRC. There is research processes have a unique character, if I can put it that way, where and it's partly, and as I can understand it or interpret it, it's very much driven by the rigor of the process and ensuring the kind of integrity of the data. And actually I'm sure the participants on the call would be able to comment on this. So there's a lot more caution around the release of data and making data available, and the potential that the data can be misinterpreted, or that there is even, I suppose, let's be honest, some reputational risk potentially. So, you know, I suppose there's a mix of all of those, whether it's implementation, perception of risk, the broader politics and reputational risk from a political context. So all of those, I think, contribute to making it somewhat closed. My experiences also with just even the open access publishing space and some of the work we did around the public health systems, it's similarly challenging. I think we're quite tied to the relationships with the publishers and those traditional kind of ways of working with publishers. And it's, I think the more that we have experiences and that we take steps to experiment with other approaches, the more we can learn together and, I suppose, de-risk and kind of share some of the risk together rather than feeling that you're doing it on your own. So I'll be honest, in my experience in joining the public sector, it's quite a conscious decision you have to make, is that you accept that there is a little bit more risk from a public perspective, and that to do something meaningful, you have to take those steps. So I think if more of us were able to, I suppose, take those incremental steps together, it would be more comfortable. And again, ultimately, then it's about the relationships, and so I think developing those relationships and managing it over time also help.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Paul, for that. I think there is a question by Professor Modi, who I just made a panelist. So Albert, I think, yeah, you are happy to ask your questions. You have all the rights to talk. Please.
Well, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Albert. Good morning. How are you?
Yes, good morning, colleagues. Paul, just a quick one. We are now under pressure to make our research applicable, not applied, but applicable and useful for people on the ground. We work with the South African Weather Service, and they are very much interested in us taking the research to the people. I'm just wondering, I mean, given that you used the example of health, how flexible is this approach or program? I just wanted to know whether there are some caveats, and one cannot just take it for granted that you can do this for any area or discipline.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good comment and good question. Certainly, so DPME, if I can take the liberty of commenting on what they've done, and most of it is available publicly, a lot of it is available publicly. They've worked with evidence mapping as a specific tool in a number of areas. So I know that land reform is available online. They've done work around human settlements as well. The work around health systems is relatively new and very much exploratory. So it has been used in a variety of areas, but I think what you're speaking to is around I suppose a broader question related to how, what approach might be used to make research more accessible. And for us, evidence mapping is useful when working with when looking to do quite a large landscape kind of analysis of what is available and to potentially identify where there are gaps in research related to specific policy issues. So I think for evidence mapping, it's quite useful in firstly, I think mapping out the policy domain from an intervention and outcome perspective in a fairly rigorous way. And I'm not sure many policy domains are that well mapped. So I think that in itself can be quite useful. But the second step is then mapping out quite a large body of evidence. So that's where I think evidence mapping can be useful. If in the case of what you're working with, it's maybe, there's maybe a smaller body of evidence, but then it's more around communicating it and packaging it or synthesizing it, then it's potentially more around how that communication is managed, how the various pieces of evidence are synthesized, and then it's looking at kind of synthesis methodologies rather than mapping, for example, or your communication approach rather than synthesis. So I think, yeah, it's really just about looking at what you're trying to do and then working with either communication tools, synthesis tools, or maybe evidence mapping type tools, depending on what your ultimate goals are. But yeah, in general, regarding the sectors, I need to think a little bit more about what the limits would be for different sectors. But my experience now is mostly in those areas, and the mapping I've seen is mostly around those kind of social sciences areas.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, for the answer, and thank you very much, Albert, for the nice question. I see, Delia, I'm not sure if your hand is still raised from earlier or whether you have a new question. I fear I didn't pay attention. Yeah.
Yes, I've got a comment.
Yeah, please, Delia, go ahead, and then we...
Yes. Yes, thank you, Paul. Just on the topic of open data, I don't know if you're aware, the previous Statistics General, Dr. Paddy Lahotla, had this dream that the census data should be open to everybody in a limited fashion, though. So there's something called the General Household Survey, where every year roughly 100 households are surveyed, where they will define the household based on the main member of the household, and then they will give you information about each person. So you could have right up to 8, 9, 10 people in the household. You will know the person's age, what they've studied, whatever, what their history is of that year, and it's extremely beautiful data. So Paddy Lahotla had this dream that it should be open, and 1 year's data, I think it's 2018, you can see on the internet right down to ward level. So you can you can home in and get all the data in your area of the questions that were asked on that household. And it's extremely interesting because it's got questions about education, about health, about maybe your medical record for the year. Have you been sick? Has anybody had a baby in this family? So it is, I wish more government offices would do that, firstly. And secondly, I wish that it wasn't just that 1 year, and it was unfortunate that Paddy Lahotla, then it was his big dream, and then when he left office, he didn't continue. But there's very rich data available in South Africa down to individual level, and you can zone it by ward. So it's really interesting. So that was just a final comment.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Delia, for that comment. I think we reached our time limit. Just a concluding remark. You know, I've always been a big supporter of open source and those kind of movements that now are very mainstream. Yeah. And I guess the same will happen with open data and open science. At the moment, I think this approach to do science is still fighting. I don't remember who mentioned the word data imperialism. Yeah? People are very protective of their data and try to collect it and keep it all themselves. Yeah? But the benefits of sharing as much as possible are just overwhelming. Yeah? Of course, there are constraints regarding privacy and things like that. But I think that's it's a movement, open science, open data, that will roll over us, and we will have to embrace it very quickly. So, Paul, thank you very much for your very insightful talk about the behind the scenes of evidence-based policy. That was really very interesting and informative. And you saw from some of the questions that there is really big interest to stay in touch with you in a social distancing sense, yeah? And keep the discussion and hopefully collaborations going. Yeah. So, and I'm sure that if the participants have further questions that they would like to ask Paul, they can easily through me or through the internet find out Paul's email address and keep the discussion going. So, Paul, again, thank you very much for your time, for waking up early today. And we are really looking forward to stay in touch with you and keep the discussion going. So, and thank you very much to Delia, Albert, Ilya for their contribution as well. Yeah. So have a good day, and we will see you again here next week with another interesting talk that we will send out the announcement later today. Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much. It was great.